The Hudson Library and Historical Society's Adult Program Series presents a special historical discussion about one of Ohio's favorite sons who became the most feared fighter pilot in World War I. Author and adventurer John F. Ross speaking about his new book, Enduring Courage, Ace Pilot Eddie Rickenbacker, and the Dawn of the Age of Speed. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker overcame physical and life course obstacles to fight valiantly in the First World War, earning him the country's two highest military honors, the Medal of Honor and the Distinguished Service Cross. Rickenbacker was also a race car driver and owned the world-famous Indianapolis Motor Speedway for many years. He also formed his own car company and founded Eastern Airlines in 1935. Amazingly, he survived 24 days adrift in the Pacific Ocean during an aborted government mission in World War II. Recorded at the Hudson Library's Flood Meeting Room on October 19, 2015.
For those of you who don't know me, my name is Gwendolyn Mayer, and I'm the archivist here at the Hudson Library and Historical Society, and I would like to welcome you. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce the speaker. Mr. Ross, John F. Ross, is with us this evening. He is a former editor of the American Heritage Magazine and the Invention and Technologies Magazine, both of which I think are great to read. He is the recipient of the 2011 Fort Ticonderoga Award for contributing to American history. Before that, he was on the board of editors at the Smithsonian Magazine, during which time he wrote 4 cover stories. On assignment, Mr. Ross has gone dog sledding with the polar Inuit in the northwest of Greenland. He has lived with the nomadic reindeer herders of Siberia. He has chased scorpions in the Baja and dived 3,000 feet underwater in the Galapagos, all for the Smithsonian, and gone mountain climbing as well. We had an extensive conversation about mountain climbing and polar exploring at dinner. He has won many honors. He's explored old castles for the Discovery Channel. He's appeared on 50 radio and television programs, keynoted many conferences, helped and run 2 magazines, and was a producer for CBS's Face the Nation, and edited many large format books for the Smithsonian Institution's press. He is quite an individual, very dynamic, probably one of the few that I have had dinner with that have done nearly as much as he has around our planet. He has come to Ohio to speak about Mr. Eddie Rickenbacker. Many of you may know as a native Ohioan, and perhaps he'll tell you how he got interested with Mr. Rickenbacker as a topic when he speaks to us. So without further ado, I wish you would welcome Mr. John F. Ross to Hudson, Ohio.
You're welcome. Thank you, Gwen. That was quite an introduction. Can everybody hear me? Very good. I just can't tell you how delighted I am to come here to Hudson. I've not been before, but particularly to Ohio, and to speak to an audience I think that knows a little bit more about Rickenbacker than probably most audiences I speak to. So nice to be in his home state. And so I'm going to talk a little bit, then I want to leave some time for questions at the end, and I hope we can have some kind of engaging conversations on that. But let me just tell you a little bit about this interesting fellow who you may know a little bit about. It's a remarkable story, and I found when I was writing it, it sometimes veered almost between truth and fiction on how remarkable this man's story is. It's about a boy who grew up in son of such poor Swiss-German immigrants in Columbus, Ohio, that he often didn't go to school because they didn't have winter coats. He wore a brown and a black mismatched shoes to school. It was beaten up for it. This is about, it's a story of a man who is a young man. He concealed a terrible eye injury. A cinder from a passing locomotive caught in his eye and burned his cornea. Nonetheless, he would become as we know, the ace of aces in World War I, shooting down more enemy airplanes than any other American. This is a story of a man, because of his last name and his accent, was suspected of being a German agent, even up until the time he was an ace. This is a story of a 7th grade dropout whose father was murdered in a terrible racial altercation that he started. So he quit school, young Eddie quit school to support his family. This is a story about a 7th grade dropout who overcame such obstacles, a college degree for one, that he not only became a pilot but also became an officer and a commander of America's most formidable squadron in World War I, the 94th, or Hat in the Ring Gang. This is a man who would go on to found Eastern Airlines. He would spend some time, 23 days, in the middle of World War II on a raft in the middle of the South Pacific and survive. It's an incredible story. So Gwen said we had a talk. Where's Gwen? We talked about, why do you write a book? Why do you pick this topic? And I started, I think I was a boy, and I read his, and I don't know if you've seen it, but Eddie Rickenbacker wrote a heavily ghost-edited memoir of his World War I experiences called Fighting the Flying Circus. The Flying Circus was the German Air Force then, and this is great story full of dog fights, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. It's a wonderfully colored thing, and it just engaged me as a child. And I just kept an eye on him, just it kind of kept popping up. But what really grabbed me enough to write this book was not just all his daredevil and the things that he went through. That was part of the plot, but what was the thematic point? I wanted to find out why this poor kid who kept getting back up after he got knocked down, after he would get injured, after people tell him he couldn't do something, he kept getting back up. And my book became, in essence, and if you read it, it became a treatise really on what courage was about. That's why I named it Enduring Courage. Not the white-hot courage that enables you to roll a car that is, pinned your child to a wall. This is the courage, of every day going and making things happen in your lives, and I was. And this was what really engaged me about this man. I needed to find out what this was all about. So, and it begs the question as a historian, does history make the man, or does man make the history? In other words, was it the times that were available then for him to take advantage, or was it something in his constitution, who he was? What was it? And this was such an interesting thing to wrestle with. There's no clear answer to that, but it really is part of both. Most definitely what happened right as he was growing up. This is a kid born in 1890, before flight and before the car, but the internal combustion engine was invented, which enabled flight and car automobiles, the effective internal combustion car engine to be built within 8 years of each other. So what happens is you have a transformation of speed in American history, just a moment when things change. It was really the beginning of the modern era. He happened to be born right then, and in Columbus, as you may know, was a center, as a great deal of Ohio was, for a lot of people who were working to try to figure out what this new technology meant, to build cars. People who had built bicycles were coming in to build racing cars. There were people who had built bird cages who were coming in. Everybody was trying to figure out what this meant because it was a big thing. Steam had been around, but these steam engines were these big hulking things on rails. The car was something that was small, it was human, it was you could change. Whole new vocabulary started to come in as people started feeling G-forces and acceleration in ways that nobody had felt quite that way systemically before. So here's Eddie Rickenbacker, was born at a time when the automobile was just in its infancy. And at the center of this was racing. And for a kid who really didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, there was an opportunity here, which he grabbed. At 16, Eddie began racing. He went and he would go on to compete on road races, on horse tracks, fields, and in the First Indy 500. He raced an airplane at a state fair. He bailed the Duesenberg brothers out of bankruptcy with a brilliant race, which he drove. He drove Peugeots, Duesenbergs, Firestone Freyrs, and Blitzen and Benz. He found that he had a knack not only for coolness at speed and raceway smarts, but a deep understanding of how engines worked. He said they talked to him. It was quite unusual. In 1916, as we know, the world was well embroiled in a very terrible World War, World War I, but America was still clinging to neutrality. Eddie, at that point, was the nation's number 3 race car driver. He dressed all in whites. People knew his name. He was 3rd in winnings and 3rd in rankings. He decided he was going to go. It might not have been such a good idea in retrospect, but he decided to go to England because he wanted to learn why the European cars with their small high torque engines were beating all of the American engines. So he wanted to go over to find out what was up with that. On board, we took a steamship over. He struck up a conversation with 2 men who seemed to be really nice. They professed to be Canadian, but he thought that their accent was a little weird. As he prepared to get off the boat in Liverpool, a police officer led him into a stateroom where he found these 2 guys. They were from Scotland Yard, and they were not very happy with him. Turns out a hack writer back in the States had made up this great story about how Eddie was, in fact, a German baron who had come over from Germany, and they took it quite seriously then. They threw him onto the floor. They ripped the heels out of his shoes, and then they took his shirt off and they rubbed lemon juice on his chest to see if there were secret messages on his chest. I kid you not. They took all of his mechanical drawings. I mean, this was a time when there was great concern about German spies, and the Scotland Yard and the Americans would be intercepting his mail, eavesdropping in on him all the way until he became an ace. On his return, Eddie came back. He knew now that war was inevitable for America, and he got an idea. He went around the country and he got all of his buddies who were car racing drivers at that point. And he decided that who else could better become airplane pilots. Remember, we're just 10 years, a decade into flight with the Wright brothers. So he went to Washington with a list of all his buddies and in his pocket. And he met with Brigadier General George D. Squires, head of the Signal Corps, and this was the guy who was bringing the country's nascent air service into being. And Eddie said, look, I got all these guys. Who else better to become the first pilots than these guys? Because they can drive cars, they can rebuild engines, they understand. And they said, well, Eddie, where's your college degree? And Eddie said, well, I took a correspondence course in engineering. They took one look at this guy, rough around the edges. Grammar wasn't so good. And they laughed in his face. When he pointed out that he had unmatched mechanical and engineering experience, they countered then that a flyer who knew too much about technology would never risk his life by getting airborne if he thought something was wrong with his engine. Of course, none of these guys the officers had never flown. Eddie said, but that's the key to the whole thing, that if you could get men to coax what it was about their engines, then it would be a whole new thing. But he had run into, again, ingrained class hostility. And he didn't grow mad. He just offered courteous thanks and silently took his leave, vowing to find another way. In truth, none of these officers or anyone had any idea of what made a good pilot back then. The best they could devise was a kind of a screwy test where they sat somebody on a potential pilot on a piano stool and spun him around, then got him up and asked him to walk backwards. So Raoul Lufberry, the best ace we had at that point, did it and almost broke his neck and didn't really work too well. So this was new territory. One thing would be for sure, though, in 2 years, none of those officers who he encountered in Washington, D.C. would ever laugh in his face again. So Eddie was called to service not as a flyer, but as a chauffeur. So he went over with Pershing's American Expeditionary Force when we got in the war. Pershing sent some folks over to look and kind of psych everything out. But Eddie didn't have any ideas. He was a newly minted sergeant. He had no plans for remaining a driver. He wanted to fly. He started driving for Billy Mitchell, and Billy Mitchell was tasked, a man who's tasked with finding an airfield for American flyers. So Eddie chauffeured him all around northeastern France, looking for a suitable place to have what they called an aerodrome at the time. On one excursion, the pair barreled along in a Hudson Super 6, this great old car, when the engine started banging and like a trip hammer, Mitchell remembers. Turns out it was a burned out connecting rod bearing. And early that afternoon, Eddie pulled into a tiny French town, dropped Mitchell off at the little hotel there, and found a garage with this old mechanic who could do nothing had no bearings to fit. So Eddie found some Babbitt metal, which is a soft alloy of metal used to make bearings. He melted it with a blowtorch, and then he made a little mold that he had improvised out of sand and water. He poured the mold in, and then he sanded the whole thing, popped it back in there, and they were back on the road in a couple hours. This is kind of characteristic of what this guy was about. It just was, nothing was orthodox. His answers for his responses to things were never orthodox, which makes him such an incredibly interesting figure. So Mitchell just was very impressed with that, and their conversations realized that he really had a diamond in the rough with Eddie, and assigned Eddie to be the chief engineer of America's biggest airfield, Issoudun. But Eddie said, I'll do it under one condition, that I learned how to fly. So he said, okay. So most of the other, basically all of the other, with a couple small exceptions, pilots had Ivy League educations. We have Quentin Roosevelt, TR's son. We have Hamilton Coolidge. We have these wonderful characters who came from a very different place than Eddie. They didn't like this guy at first, to say the least. He had all of these Ivy League guys out collecting rocks with the German POWs in tin buckets. The rocks would fly up and break the wooden propellers. So he had enough of that. So these young pilots who were hotshots didn't really like being out there with the POWs, but Eddie made sure that they did their service on that. So he attended a few lectures, but mostly he would go, when he had some time off, he'd take a plane and he'd go out by himself to learn and practice a way for people could learn him. He had no access to instruction manuals. None had been written at the time. He only had his wits and kind of a very keen ability to learn by doing. The first time he got up, he couldn't land. When he prepared to touch down, he looked down and he depressed the stick and he executed the perfect landing, and there was nothing. He looked over and he was 25 feet off the ground. The eye injury that I mentioned about had really thrown off his depth perception. So he had to kind of make another pass and just kind of really begin to learn that. And another thing is he got terribly sick every time he flew. He'd throw up in the cockpit, he would throw up when he got out. I mean, it was just terrible, and for 6 months it was nonstop. This was not something that it would seem to be, he and flying were not just kind of, at first didn't seem to be something that would match, but he kept at it. And so he continued to push harder, and of course war at that point was just demanding more and more to take these very frail, I don't know if you guys have seen these little airplanes, the SPAD and the Newports, but they weigh 700 or 800 pounds, and you can kind of shake them like this. These are they're tiny. When you look at them, they're tiny. And as I said, war was pressing everybody to have as many advantages and to take advantage and to take more risks. And one of the things that they were playing with is the most dangerous thing you can do in flying, which is a tailspin, where you just throw and you just go like this. To imagine a spin, as one writer imagined it recently, you visualize yourself dangling several hundred, so you're in a car, and the back of the bumper is attached to a rope that is coming off a flag. And so you're looking down, and you're looking down on the streets of Cleveland or wherever. And then an invisible hand sets the rope swinging in a wide circle while separately spinning the car as it's doing that, right? Then you cut the rope. So that's what it is. It's a very disorienting, everything in your body is screaming, bah. It sets off every alarm bell. In 1949, the FAA, predecessor of the FAA, took spin recovery off the list of requirements for attaining a pilot's license because so many people were dying trying to do it. And this is after they knew what the spin was, how to get out of it, and books had been written about it. Trying to kind of set a stage to show you that, when Eddie tried to do it, and he went out to purposely throw himself in a tailspin, when he had only heard kind of a very brief conversation among two people about how to get out of it, it was really throwing himself into in a crazy place. So Eddie, and one for being pretty dramatic, finally did get his tailspin down. Nobody knew he could do it. And every Sunday afternoon, they liked to play football. Again, all these guys were Ivy Leaguers, and football was really popular then, as it is now. And he decided to pull a spin over the game, and he pulled out 50 feet above the thing. And everybody scattered. There were dignitaries there. I mean, he was, he even later acknowledged it was a little close. He was grounded for a while, but he had shown his stuff. You can imagine too when you're in the trenches and it's mud, and the trenches, as you remember, for World War I didn't move very much at all. So these guys were huddled in there. An artillery shell could take out 25 or 30 men in a heartbeat. You're in mud. There are rodents. When they looked up and they saw these planes, they were like knights up in the sky. They seemed to just be detached from everything, just beautiful and clean in these mano-a-mano chess games up in the sky. It was a little different than that, though. So let's go up in a Newport 28, which they started with. It's a solo machine, so you're on your own. You've learned by watching a French instructor sit in a stripped fuselage on the ground and listening to them in French as they tell you, if you operate the joystick and do this, this is what's going to happen. The mechanic spins the propellers, and you go off, and you just got to do it yourself. I found a letter from Quentin Roosevelt. Remember I told you he was TR's youngest son. He was taking off one day when a piece of mud kicked up, broke the propeller, punctured the gas tank. The fire burst forth and swallowed up the entire aircraft in 30 seconds, right? So he's just off the ground. He just pops it back down. He jumps out, and his teddy bear suit, which they had to wear because they didn't have heated cockpits or anything like that, which was fur-lined and all like that, everything was on fire, and he had to roll around. These aircraft were pyres waiting to be lit. They were wooden frames covered in cloth and then covered in highly flammable dope to stiffen the whole thing. The Newport featured a rotary engine, which, as you know, it's a backwards of regular cars, in which, in essence, the cylinders wheel clockwise around a stationary crankcase, right? So it's like, so in essence, the engine is spun around like a gyroscope, and they used those because they couldn't cool the engines very well. So this was a way to cool the engines. They hadn't worked that. So it works. It creates this incredible torque of hundreds of pounds going off in a clockwise direction. So as you're taking up, and the engine's often cut out, and if your engine did cut out and you're just taking off and you happen to steer in the direction of that, you would go right down and you'd kill yourself. And this happened so many times, it's just, it's terrible to see. 1 of 9 trainees died. This is before they even, obviously got shot at. So the rotary engine also, so I'm telling you about the cooling thing, they cooled with castor oil. And what does castor oil, right, castor oil, and it spat off, the engine spat off 2 gallons of this stuff every hour. And a good amount of it came back in the face of the poor guy driving. The pilots called these engines whirling sprays. So in part, those really great, white scarves, they were to wipe off the castor oil. You know what castor oil does? I don't know if you've ever had castor oil, but it does bad things to your stomachs and your insides. You just get, it's not good. They would take blackberry liqueur up and brandy and stuff like that to try to settle their nerves. The letters are just wonderful to read because these are kids. They get wonderful champagne for 25 cents a bottle. And of course, Quentin Roosevelt could lift his throat back and drink an entire bottle of champagne would flow down his throat. So these guys were just drinking and they were young, 20, 19, 18, right? This one poor guy's letter goes up, eats 2 pounds of candies that his parents sends him. He goes up there, he throws up, it freezes to everything in his body. He can't see out of his goggles, so he takes his goggles. I mean, these guys are just figuring out, they're young, this is exciting, it's dangerous, their friends are dying, it's just, So these guys had no radios, right? They were getting lost all over the place. You can't really take maps up because there was a lot of wind was going, and you couldn't be looking down too much because because an enemy could come by. And the cockpit got so cold, like I was saying, freezing, that even with wearing these suits, one guy, Lieutenant William Muir of the 95th, you cannot imagine how bitter it is. He said, I put on a couple of knitted masks, then Allen's leather fur-lined helmet and my goggles. Even then, the part of my face which is exposed stiffens and prevents me from moving my mouth. They'd often find themselves peeling when they got down the fingers one by one off their joysticks. So cool. And as you know, when you get to 10,000 feet, the air starts getting rarefied. There is less oxygen. The FAA today says you have to have, if you fly above 10,000 feet, you have to have supplemental oxygen. It's the law. And for good reason. Your cognitive functions, if you don't have supplemental air, get compromised. You get tunnel vision, all sorts. Now, these guys were flying to 17 and 18,000, and later in the war, 20 and 21,000 feet. They were young, no doubt, but things were kind of interesting on that front. To make matters worse, and I saw this, it's heartbreaking in the letters to see these guys talking about this. The pilots knew that they might need to make a terrible decision, which was new in the history of warfare, a sudden decision. And that was the prospect of catching fire from an enemy's bullets, from a spark from their engine, could set this pyre, as I mentioned. It was just ready to go. And they would be miles above the earth, right, and with their plane on. And it was very easy before they got to the ground that their entire frame could burn up. Right, and this is a terrible way to die. So these guys would have these conversations. I might add too, I forgot to mention, parachutes were invented, but nobody, the headquarters had decided that parachutes were defeatist. That if a pilot wore a parachute, kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, that if something went wrong, at the first hint they would jump out of the airplane, right? Now, this pissed off Eddie Rickenbacker because he saw some of his friends die who could have. The Germans in the last 6 weeks of the war introduced parachutes, and a lot of people were saved from that, but we never did. Again, this was such new territory that they hadn't figured that out. So again, here we are, a few miles up. What do? Do you jump? Do you burn to death? Do you try to take the airplane into a spin, which will burn out, which will blow out the flames, which is not likely? Or do you burn to death? Do you jump? Some guys took up a service revolver, but all too often this happened. That was a decision that people talked about on the ground. These kids talked about on the ground and made up their minds what they would do if that happened. And so if this wasn't bad enough, the first planes they flew carried a bad design flaw. So we decided we were going to get into the war, and we would throw a lot of money and build airplanes. Of course, we were going to do that. And we suddenly realized that the pace of airplane technology had gone so fast that we really didn't, in the war, just in the last 3 years, we didn't know what was going on. So we couldn't. So we had to enter the war. We bought French airplanes. And we got some French airplanes that the French really didn't like a whole lot, these Newport 28s. And probably for good reason. And Eddie experienced this firsthand. It was May of 1918, and Eddie was over enemy-occupied territory near the medieval city of Nancy. He spied 3 German Albatross planes below him. He always wanted to be up high so you could get, element of surprise. They didn't see him. He might have been a little dopey from that oxygen starvation thing I was telling you about. He threw the airplane in a precipitous dive, so-called zoom, they called it. He screamed down on the tail of one of these guys, got close enough to see the enemy's bobbing head in astonishment, looking back at him. One squeeze of his Lewis machine gun loosed 50 rounds, and the Albatross catapulted in death spin. He got one of them. But the exhilaration, of course, lasted only a second because there were the other 2 Albatrosses were now on his tail. And a dogfight broke out. And a dogfight, it was a newly minted word, and it's a wonderful word because it just really captures the insanity and the ferocity and the uncertainty of what an interaction in the sky is. What people everything is going like this. So in trouble, Eddie knew he had to get it back up and get some altitude, because if he got too low, he would just have no place to go. So he jerked back his stick, they called it bouncing. And so he got his nose up like this, just to shoot up in a gut-wrenching change of direction. And with a loud crack, the fabric over the leading edge of his upper starboard, his right wing, peeled back. So it was, from the spar, it was flapping like a flag in the wind. And the technology on how they had put the adhesed the fabric onto that spar was weak, and it was a technology flaw that they would try to fix. But deprived of half of his lift, he went into this very awkward tailspin, and then his engine cut out. And I kind of figure in that case most people would have kind of given up. It again is that incredibly just confusing, terrible things, and they was getting shot at the same time. He galvanized into action, he kicked into activity, he wrenched the stick from side to side, stomped the rudder, banging his body, just trying to get off of this very awkward tailspin. But he couldn't modify it all. He said he couldn't modify even the slightest, the gyrations in the Newport. And everything slowed, he writes. Quote, "My whole life seemed to go through my mind like a moving picture as he plummeted 2 miles down. I wondered whether the airplane would disintegrate around me and let me free fall, whistling through the wind. Would I strike the ground and splatter all over?" He saw German soldiers watching on the ground, watching his Icarus-like fall. He imagined how they would pick over his body and carry off pieces of the shattered machine for souvenirs. He envisioned his mother opening the door of their little house in Columbus to receive a cablegram announcing his death. Only a few seconds remained. No emergency procedures came automatically to mind. They hadn't yet really been devised. For Eddie, there was only that crippling reality of a wildly disorienting, stomach-screwing spin into the earth. But then his panic, and this is where his training as a race car driver and it really came in. His panic suddenly shifted into steely resolve. This is a moment that some people have, which he has, a few people have. And the accumulated knowledge from methodical practice sessions kicked in, and just a couple feet from the ground, he threw his weight into the left, quote, "weight to the left-hand side over the cockpit, jam the controls, cross them, and jam the engine wide open." So an explosion lit the cowling with blue flame, but the whole thing suddenly sputtered and vibrated violently, and finally went off on one wing, headed for France. Ordinary reasoning would suggest that engaging the engine as you're going right down would just drive you more quickly into the ground. But instead, the speed he gained imparted just enough lift so that he could pull out of this spin. And he got out of it. The enemy had left him a few minutes earlier for dead, seeing his situation. He barely limped home, almost hit the barracks building, and then landed. And there's a picture of him, and he looks like he's just seen a ghost. It's about the only picture I've seen of him where he's not got this cocky grin. He just, so he went around and threw up behind the barracks. Following day, as all of these guys did, they climbed aboard a different Newport. This time with a little bit more knowledge about being careful about hitting that one maneuver. It's hard to imagine how much changed in aviation technology in only 4 years in World War I. One historian calculates that the advantage in the air between the Allies and the Germans shifted 18 times, right? A change would come when a more efficient plane was introduced. A change came when they figured out the innovation about how to shoot a machine gun through the spinning propellers. So you could shoot, instead of just around, you could shoot where you were pointing your plane. There also changes came with the development of new tactics and formation flying. These young pilots were innovating on the fly, flying on the seat of their pants, constantly adapting. And this was a kind of environment that really favored the skills of someone like Rickenbacker. As a matter of fact, in the 4 years of World War I, every air-to-air tactical engagement, every maneuver was invented that we know today. Everyone, except one that I was talking to one fellow about that you can only do in a jet engine with that kind of speed, but everything else was. All of the other loops, all of the other movements were invented in this short period of time. Incredible. Boelke and Immelmann, the Germans had pioneered the concept of lead and wingman. The Red Baron, as I mentioned, turned his flying circus into formation flying that were just truly formidable. So what did these airplanes do, for the war effort? When they first came out, they were dropping darts on, they were dropping darts and little fused bombs on things. And they were, at first they didn't even shoot at the other airplanes from the other side because they both realized as they were passing, they would wave at each other because they were both doing something so dangerous. They were more, they just didn't, they didn't even bother, but then soon they began to take up rifles and shoot at each other. And then, as I said, it morphed so fast that they were shooting with these big machine guns that were shooting through the propellers, and it became a whole different thing. But what did it mean in World War I? Well, what it did is it just changed the entire dynamics of the battlefield because people could see, there were troop movements, couldn't be hidden anymore. And I've got a bunch of examples I won't get into, but there was just a really, just a lot of kind of very, very critical things that happened that airplanes as observers really made a difference in. So it didn't become very, it didn't take very long to realize that one wanted to cripple the other airplanes coming over to take a look, the German airplanes, so they couldn't take photographs, so they couldn't provide information on that. So it soon became evident that Eddie had a skill. He wasn't the best pilot. He wasn't the most accurate shooter. But when it came to putting them all together, he had a special skill. And he and this fellow, Doug Campbell, got into a race to be the first ace in the American service, ace being the first person to shoot down 5 enemy airplanes. Campbell narrowly won that race, though it would finally turn out, as I've argued, that actually Eddie got there first. But you needed, when you shot down somebody behind enemy lines, you needed independent confirmation. And though we shot down somebody, his 5th before Doug Campbell did, it took many days for his to come back. So I actually think that he was the first. Luck did play a little bit of a role in Eddie's survival. When the 94th Air Squadron, which he was a part of, was first posted to the hot sector against the top German flyers, Eddie was in the hospital for a painful mastoid operation. The doctors said he would never go fly again. He would go home, but he got them to change his minds. He just wasn't, and he flew for a long time with just terrible pains in the ear. He got back to a very demoralized 94th that was just really shot up and shaken. A lot of their top guys had died. Morale was terrible. And in September 1918, Eddie assumed command of the 94th Aero Squadron over the heads of others longer in the service than he, a lot more with more training, and certainly others that resembled officers more than Eddie did. But they all agreed that he was the guy. And it's very rare to see a very hotshot warrior so ably step into command. It's a very different kind of job that is entailed. With American troops rolling in by the day, the Germans understood it was really now or never right at the end, and they really had to go, put everything up there. So Eddie had to kind of just take everything up. And so when he took command, what he did, he first gathered the pilots and bucked up their spirits. He laid down some new laws. He said that they were going to fly often aggressively. There were specific instructions. They were flying SPADs now. They were not to rev their engines at full throttle all the time, to back off, only when engaged in dogfights. He realized that, that a bunch of people were dying. Again, this is so new, this whole thing. When they were coming in, these guys would come in at 10,000 feet, see the aerodrome, and come right in like this. And they were passing out as they were doing that, and they were dying. So Eddie said, okay, before you land, you have to circle the aerodrome twice before you did that. And people stopped not dying. He started really mentoring these new kids coming that didn't know anything. He inspected the rounds of ammunition, made them file so they wouldn't jam each piece. Then he got the mechanics together, and he said to the mechanics, and these were like two different things, that, he said the success of this whole endeavor is it's critical that you guys do your job here too, equal to that of the pilots, because he knew and nobody had ever talked to them like that before. They got their instructions. The engine overhaul times had to be longer because they were just, a lot of times they had pilots ready to go, but the planes weren't ready to go because they were overhauling the engines. So the mechanics under Eddie's guidance managed to get longer engine overhauls, so they would spend more time in the air. Among the flyers, a new vocabulary came into being that Eddie instituted. This is interesting about kind of leadership skills, but a newcomer started out as an egg and moved up to proving himself to a vulture, thence a gopher, and finally to a gimper. Being a good scout or friend wouldn't just cut it alone. Quote, to do your best work, you must have a mutual feeling of confidence in the gimper flying beside you that is unequaled anywhere else. Gimpers didn't lose their nerve. For Eddie, quote, a man who is not a gimper can't stay with the squadron, and he was ruthless about that. Going to a pink T, Eddie told a reporter, is going up in the air after a German. Cuckoo birds are always talking about pink Ts, though they never have them. A cuckoo bird is an aviator who does all his fighting while none of the gimpers are around and then comes back and tells about it. So what he was doing was he was really redefining what a squadron was all about, what responsibility was about here in his very, gimper and cuckoo bird and his pink tea vocabulary. He was really making a difference. Many of these things which would be inculcated and brought into our air service, down the line. The squadron reported one pilot had begun to love him. I don't know how to explain it. At first he was just an uneducated, tough bastard who threw his weight around the wrong way, but he developed into the most natural leader I ever saw. During the last week of September and the first week of October 1918, the enemy, as I was mentioning, was considerably beefing up its air pressure against the First Army. They increased their pursuit squadrons from 5 to 12. They appeared in large formations. They were now bombing and strafing the American front lines, going for observation balloons, which were large balloons, hydrogen balloons that were put up to spy on the enemy troop movements. The fight for air supremacy was on. And then Eddie bent the 94th Air Squadron to this deadly challenge with unified intensity. And it would be critical in the Allied Meuse-Argonne offensive. And should this offensive not prove decisive, the weather would likely push the war into 1919, bringing untold consequences to the ravaged European nations on both sides, especially as civil war boiled over in Russia. So it became very critical. And in 1918, it all centered on this final 47-day offensive, centered on a 20-mile section of the Southern Front, and defined by the Argonne Forest and the Meuse River. The Germans, in between, ran an east-west hogback upon which lorded several heavily defended eminences, the most evident being the 1,100-foot Mount Faucon. And to break the German army and win the war, the U.S. First Army must take this and the Cunel Heights and other very staunchly held prominences in this devil's labyrinth. Pershing had no option but to take it by attacking up the defiles and running right on the ridgeline and running right into these machine gun nests, which were just brutal. What Pershing needed to count on was some elements of surprise, because otherwise it was going to be a total slaughter of Americans. And they needed to neutralize the Drachen, which were the dragons, which are these great observation balloons of the Germans. And this is what Eddie turned himself to. I can't get into all the details. It's an incredible story of how they brought those down and then hid this mass movement on the border as best as possible, and allowed some surprise that really began to really take the day. Eddie and his team, something that was interesting was happening too in the way these aces and the Air Force and these men were beginning to look at. Nobody had heard of these guys before, and now their names were over all of the newspapers. And Eddie and his team were showing that to the Germans and to Europeans in general, that the Americans could match and even outmatch them in the air, not just as cowboys, but as school group practitioners. There was a kind of the start of a new form of kind of American manhood and herodom. It was rooted in the Midwest practicality. It was something that began right there, that began to happen, up against these the very landed nobility of the Europeans. The Americans were introducing something very different, and they were on a international stage. Now we were for the first time, and we played a significant difference. And on November 11th, the war was over, and the 94th had become the most illustrious American fighter squadron. And Eddie's leadership had spurred the 94th far ahead of every other squadron in pretty much every index of their deathly excellence. They flew more hours than any others. They lost less aircraft for each enemy that they killed than the others. 5 pilots became aces while serving the 94th. Doug Campbell, Eddie's friend Reed Chambers, Harvey Cook, and Eddie. But of all of the aces, Eddie had shot down the most, 26 of them, which become the more remarkable because his actual service totaled less than 5 months when you all add up all his hospitalizations, his convalescence, and leave. So anyway, so after the war, Eddie would continue his remarkable career. This time, nobody would laugh in his face. He would design and build a new car. He would found and run Eastern Airlines, as I mentioned. He became an important diplomatic figure in World War II. And then again, there's the raft story, which you just have to read in my book. It's just really terrific. So in the end, what was it that drove this remarkable man? And I think that this story is about courage, like I mentioned. It's the kind that George Washington had, Abe Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant. And it's the kind that built this country. Enduring courage. Thank you. I'd be delighted to take some questions if we have time. Do we have time? Yes, sir.
Would you elaborate a little more on that last battle of World War I, where you said that Pershing had to send his troops up against this very highly fortified German position, and how the air power helped that situation?
Yeah. So.
Can you just repeat the question?
Yes. So the last final offensive in the war, when Pershing realized he had to fight against very entrenched German positions, how did the air, elaborate a little bit more on how the air war kind of helped that play out? The Germans had a series of lines that they could retreat back to. And so they had set up so that they could return back and back and back. And so, but obviously on these large, high profile mountains, and with the nature of the terrain such, had set up, as I was mentioning, their machine guns. So we were going to lose a certain number of people anyway, and Pershing has been a little bit lambasted over the decades by pushing men into meat grinders. But in a certain point, that's a big kind of argument that is kind of ongoing. This was a situation where they just had to storm these virtually invulnerable heights. And the question was, along this you got to remember this is also 20 miles, it's a very small area. To move the troops around to give an idea when you're going to strike, and to move on very muddy, awful roads, and to move vast amounts of troops on this. If the Germans can see it, they had these Drachen that would go up about a couple miles back. These big hydrogen balloons would go up with observers in it, in baskets below, looking at that. The more that the Germans could see where our troops were massing and where we were going to attack, they would entrench more and then be able to bring their divisions to support the fight against it. So it became ever critical in this cat and mouse game to blind them. And blinding them happened by shooting down these big gas balloons, which were harder to shoot down than you would think. When you came in, it was very dangerous. They were about 2,000 feet high. They had artillery around that the shells were set to explode, the Germans, around these Drachen. So when the airplanes came in, they had to get pretty close to get a good shot at it. They would shoot up and explode. So it was extremely dangerous to go get these guys. But then in a period of 3 or 4 days, we shot down a great number of these Drachen, and in essence blinded them, which gave Pershing some more maneuverability space and some element of surprise on the ground. It's a lot more detailed than that, but it's a long conversation, but yeah. Yes?
Is there mythology about the rivalry between Rickenbacker and Baron von Richthofen, or did they face off against?
Yeah, that's always an interesting question, right? So he died, the Baron died, the Red Baron died before Eddie got in service. So they never did. However, he did come up against a number of the German pilots that the Richtofen had taught. And Richtofen had started the flying circus. He had painted his plane scarlet red, everything. And everybody said, what are you doing that for? You're just going to call attention to yourself. And he said, that's exactly what I intended to do. And his flying circus, everybody could paint their planes any way they wanted, except it couldn't be all scarlet. They had to leave one part of it not. scarlet. Green or yellow or something is fine. So the Red Baron was really, but he had laid the ground for formation flying, for this kind of, some of the camaraderie and some of the intimidation that happened. So Eddie would run right smack into that, but not the Baron. Yes, sir?
Could you talk about his survival on the raft in World War II for a minute or two?
Yeah, I'll give you a quick one on that. So World War II, let's skip forward from World War I, which is in 1917, 1918. In the 40s, World War II. He is in his early 50s. He is has founded Eastern Airlines. He is this big figure. He takes $1 a year to go around to talk to troops all over the country, all over the world. He's doing all that. FDR, the president, has a little bit of a problem with Douglas MacArthur, general in the South Pacific in Papua New Guinea, who's shooting his mouth off and not saying things that the president really wants to hear. So they, get together. The president gets his cabinet together and they start talking. Who can we send down to shut this guy up and at least talk to him? And that was a formidable thing to do because MacArthur was, they picked a fellow Medal of Honor winner, Eddie Rickenbacker, and they said, Eddie, go down. It was oral communication. There were no written orders. And he flew out of Hawaii on a bomber with 7 other military guys, flyers, and they missed their fueling stop in the South Pacific, a tiny little island. And they landed, and nobody had ever done this successfully. They landed their airplane in the sea. And they got into these rafts, 3 rafts, about the size of a bathtub, 3 men, 3 and 2, I think it was. And they were right on top of each other, and their radio had not gone out. Nobody knew where they were. And the long and the short of it was there was no food, there was no water. That would change after as a result of this. They would put food and water on rafts and airplanes. There were sharks. They had taken most of their clothes off, so the sun would sunburn them, open up boils, the salt water would come over. There were sharks were moving right under every time one person moved, they were hallucinating. They couldn't eat. They were talking about cutting off their pinkies and their earlobes to fish. And then, on the 9th day, a seagull lands on Eddie Rickenbacker's head. And this has become this legendary story that everybody around that time eventually would know. This was this incredible thing. Landed on it, and all these eyes looked at Eddie. And Eddie knew there was a bird on his head, and he reached up and he grabbed that. And they used its guts to fish, and they survived a little bit of that. And then it still got really bad. And right at one point, one of the guys he knew jumps over the side, can't take anymore, is committing suicide. And Eddie reaches over, grabs the guy's arm, and they pull him back in. And the next morning, the guy, they're right there, but he sticks his hand out to Eddie and says, Eddie, I'm sorry, I don't shake my hand, I'm sorry, I don't know what I was doing. And Eddie took over control of the whole boat right then, of all of those guys right there, when he said, I'm not shaking your hand, you coward. And he went off and started blue streak. I think he could, it was, he knew how to castigated this guy just furiously. And any time from then on, when anybody ever said, oh, I can't take this anymore, it was just awful out there. And they couldn't take it, he would jump down their throats. And pretty soon, all these guys got to hating Eddie Rickenbacker so much they wanted to throw him over the side. But you know what? They weren't thinking about dying anymore. 23 days later, they were saved. His wife, this is an incredible love story, his wife had gone into the Secretary of Navy. After 2 weeks, we were in the middle of a war, we just couldn't keep sending planes out to look for these guys. After 2 weeks, they cut it off. His wife went down and said to the Secretary of Navy, you got to do it for another week. Got to do it for another week. This is a guy's a hero. On the last day of the last week, they were found and pulled in. It's incredible to see the pictures. All the guys at that said, we don't like Eddie Rickenbacker, but they all said, he saved our lives. And that story is just such an incredible play within a play. It really shows that this guy was an unorthodox thinker that could pull something out that was just really out of the box. And time again, he did that. And he went down, saw MacArthur. They became great buddies. And, and he became this hero on, this account was right as we were trying to dig the Japanese out of the South Pacific. It looked like we were going to go from island to island, and nobody was going to surrender. We're going to have to dig everybody out of these things. And here was Eddie, who had survived. And on Life magazine, 3 issues in a row, here he was. He became the symbolic of our ability to withstand and to succeed. So he became this real figure, who said, come on, guys, just buck it up. We're gonna get it done. And had a real effect on this country. Anyway, more details on that in my book. But that's it. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Could you explain to me how you do shoot a machine gun through a spinning wooden propeller at the front of a plane?
Well, this was a terrible thing because if you're trying on something that's going up, when you're flying and you're shooting around, it's very hard to get any kind of base. So you want to have where you are pointing your plane, and you can press it. If it goes right through there, it's a whole different thing. First, they tried to put little steel deflectors on the inside of the blades, and so if a bullet hit it, then it would deflect off. But that always was a problem because sometimes you would hit your propeller and then you could die. So then Anthony Fokker, and there was some precedence for this, but worked on an interrupter gear, which actually forced the machine gun rounds only to fire when there was a gap between the propellers, and that changed everything. And that was the beginning of real modern warfare in the sky. And that's a great story too. Yeah. Well, terrific. I thank you all for coming tonight, and again, great fun.
Thanks to the management and staff of the Hudson Library and Historical Society for their assistance in the production of this program and for providing the adult program series for the citizens of Hudson. For a DVD or Blu-ray copy of this or any HCTV program, contact Hudson Cable Television at 330-653-2500 or via email at hctv@hudson.oh.us.